Okay, welcome to this conversation. And hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here today with Baxter Stein, who works at a large financial institution and have been leading in building different AI products and data products. And so, Baxter, welcome to this conversation. I'm really excited to talk about different things today.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me, Joyce.
So, one of the things that you recently wrote about in your Substack, which caught my eyes, is about the writing process and writing and AI. So, tell us a bit more about that article you wrote and the motivation and key takeaways.
Yeah, for sure. I've definitely been personally motivated to, do my own writing outside of a work context just to, keep building critical thinking skills, which I think, we live in a world that's actually pretty hostile to deep thinking. So I started writing just to work through my own thoughts, explore my own curiosities, try to build a little bit of an audience. And have really enjoyed that process. You know, I started writing, years ago when I graduated college, and that kind of intersected with the rise of generative AI. And so I just like wanted to do a little bit of a pause and reflect on, what were the before times like? What are things like now? With these new tools, like what types of skills will be more valued when it comes to writing? And yeah, I've just try to reflect a bit on my own process and share that with others.
I think that's great. And you talk about sort of the pre-Gen AI time of writing. I
Mhm.
know you're also a graduate of University of Chicago. We had to write a lot in our college days.
Yeah.
So how does writing help with deep thinking or forming that course of inquiry? And perhaps as you think about now with a lot of these different Gen AI tools coming to market, how does that change the process, or how does that aid our thinking as writers?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to think about writing as like having two sources of value. One is for yourself, just interrogating your own thoughts, like getting them down, like having a place that you can, that forces you to like collapse down your thoughts into, something that you can look at on paper. And then the other part of it is obviously communicating with an audience and figuring out like what that audience values and what they need and, using writing as a tool to communicate. But I think that there's a lot of emphasis on that communication front, but what goes overlooked a lot is how important writing is just to the thinking process and working through ideas. And so, I've been really excited about the ways that some generative AI tools can actually facilitate or enhance, my ability to think through complex ideas, make connections. If you're very intentional about the way that you approach it. But I also have seen and talked to people who really feel like, it's shortcutting a lot of thinking and, we're losing that skill set to some extent. So, yeah, I think, like anything, there has to be the right balance, but reflecting on the days in college when you struggle like at 2 a.m. trying to get something on a paper, like those days are obviously gone. And I don't want to comment too much on the educational aspect of all of this because I feel like I'm kind of removed from that and definitely not an expert, but just like as an average person who likes to write, I think, you know, the shift is very much going away from struggling to get something on a page to struggling to like work through the many different options that you have that the generative AI tools give you and like trying to refine, curate, and find the best way to, you know, get your ideas out there and have them land with people.
Okay, so let's say that you have an idea, you want to write something,
Hmm.
and maybe you have written a few things down just sort of as outline, but you're maybe limited in time, or you want
Yeah.
more of a creative motivation or source of getting started further or continue to do that further. How would the generative AI tools that you have seen that are being used today help with that? Whether it's extending the initial outline or helping with writer's block or How should people think about that process in this new time?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great question. You know, everyone's faced writer's block. Everyone's kind of struggled with a blank sheet of paper, I think, at some point. And well, first of all, I think like some of that friction or discomfort you feel is often a good thing because it's forcing you to really wrestle with something that you have in your head. But at the same time, like the nice thing about the, you know, LLM tooling is that you can kind of take a very unstructured, sort of baked thought and really turn it into something real, and pretty much instantly by just like giving a simple prompt. And some of the like the approach that I think has been most valuable to my own writing is thinking about, starting with that like half-baked thought, but then coming up with as many different combinations of that idea as possible. And so you can really like take a look at like what are all the different branches or different directions you could take this idea and start to like then come up with your own way of evaluating like, okay, which one of these approaches is the best, like whether it's a combination of different claims, different evidence, different styles. You can start to piece it together from there, but at least you have something to react to and respond to. And I think that is something that really helps facilitate both the thinking and the writing. And it can be a little bit too frictionless sometimes, but I think again, it's all about finding the right balance.
Do you then view this as sort of your writing assistant or writing coach, or how would you describe this pairing relationship?
Yeah, I think that's probably the right way to think about it. You don't want to you don't want to treat LMs as like a ghostwriter that's just doing the work for you. You want to think of it as like a tool that you can use to bounce ideas off of, help you like help it critique what you're thinking. So again, you have to be very intentional about asking for actual criticism because oftentimes it will just say like you're the greatest, and I think we've all had that experience. So I think it's all about having that intentionality of how like creating your own system and then configuring the tools to work for you, by asking the right prompts, by taking the right approach to evaluating the outputs and iterating many times over, until you find that kind of like sweet spot or like process that works well for you.
So you obviously have a lot of experience writing and doing research and compiling those research into critical writing with clear thesis, clear structure, as you talked about, evidence to support the thesis or the debate that you outline in your writing or the perspective. Um, how do you, I suppose, train the generative AI tool using writing good prompts so that it's not just giving you compliments. It's
Yeah.
actually, you're really trying to make it to work hard to give uh, critical feedback or good creative ideas that build
Hmm.
and extend your existing writing or your base writing.
Yeah. I think again, you have to think of it as like creating your own system from end to end, not just a prompt and response, but thinking holistically about your approach. And one of the things I think is great is like the foundational models, like the big labs, like, their systems are so inherently customizable because they're meant for like general purpose use. And so if you come at it the right way with like, being very thoughtful about your prompts, but also loading in the right context, examples of writing that you have that you think was really strong. I would say like examples of what you look for, like the values you have as a writer, as an editor. Um, and I think the most important thing is actually loading in context about audiences. So like being very specific about like who your audience is and what they value and like spending a lot of time with your writing tool or agent or co-pilot, to like make them understand your audience because that's ultimately going to produce like some of the best outcomes and help you work together in a productive way. And I've been thinking about just like shifting the mindset away from being just being a writer to being more of an editor, and not editor in the sense of like, making sure the grammar and like, vocabulary is all good, but thinking about like an editor holistically, like what value does an audience have, and like how can we drive that with the writing? And I think like taking that perspective helps you think about like all the different ways you can configure the tool to facilitate that work. So those are some of the things I think about for sure.
So now, now you have sort of worked with a lot of different these tools to help you with your writing process. We have seen on the coding side, there are a lot of different co-pilots, both embedded in large platforms and emerging companies
Hmm.
helping with coding. There are co-pilots for other verticals and industries for different knowledge-based tasks. So for writing specifically, how do you sort of see that set of capabilities evolve? What are the gaps? What are the things that we already have that they do pretty well? And where do you see the future of, writing co-pilots go um, in terms of its direction and opportunities?
Hmm. Yeah, I think like I was saying before, the big labs, like the big models are, so flexible. It's kind of like having, Microsoft Excel or something. So if you're really good with Excel, you can pretty much like, build all kinds of things on top of that. And I think that's kind of where we are now, where like you can customize your experience using Claude or ChatGPT like pretty well by loading in context and knowing how to like, prompt in the right way. But ultimately, I think like the direction that most industries are going in is like having these more like verticalized or specialized softwares. And so, you see that for lawyers have their own like writing tools, and marketers have, their own sophisticated kind of like wrapper tools, right? And as a like more of a hobbyist or like amateur writer, there probably isn't like anything like super amazing on the market, but there are some like tools emerging as well that kind of repackage, the models in a slightly more opinionated way. But I think that there's probably further to go. So I'm definitely like on the lookout for tools that have more, like I said, opinionated interfaces and user experiences, tools that like really help you focus on the visualization and like the branching of different ideas and help, evaluate the strength of different arguments, and explore kind of like how concepts connect together. Like, I think there's, those are kind of very specialized features that you can imagine, but some things that, obviously the big labs are not going to have time to go like that deep into building like these really specialized workflows. And I think that there's lots of opportunities for founders or creators to kind of like see what works well for them and then build that out, and see if it also like helps other people.
When you say opinionated
Yeah.
kind of view, what does that mean in your opinion? Like not just like generalized outputs
Hmm.
that sort of comes from a typical large language model output.
Yeah. I mean, for example, right now the way you work with like Claude is pretty linear. Like you can create a draft and then it has like pretty good version control if you want to like, you know, engage with that draft, or you can like actually edit it right in line, which is pretty cool. Um, but I think like some of the things that are missing are more in the like ideation phase or research phase, where you have a lot of different directions you can take a piece of writing or an argument, and it's kind of up to you to have a chat interface with those ideas. But like when you're in the chat mode, it's sometimes hard to, you're kind of steering it in one direction, but like oftentimes you want to, branch out and have like, this is one version of an argument that prioritizes this bit of evidence, and another version of an argument has this evidence. And it's hard to manage like all those different threads. So I think that's just like one example where opinionated software can help, the writer, editor, or just like user engage with those different ideas and really make the most of the thinking and ideation process before it gets like, turned into this, long document that is kind of cumbersome to manage.
Do you think that these Gen AI writing tools, even the new ones that you're thinking about, um, will have the most impact on creative writing or more like news generation or news article writing? Where do you think the
Yeah.
biggest impact could be?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful it's more in the nonfiction space just because yeah, I think it's totally different approach. And I haven't spent too much time in the fiction creative writing space. But I have seen some tools that are supposed to help with creative writing in particular. So I think it's all like, there's so many different like use cases for writing, for lack of a better word. And there you're gonna see like specialized tools for each one. But yeah, I do think like, you know, in the educational context, obviously that's a huge area, but also just for people who are knowledge workers or professionals, I think like having more specialized tools will really help make sense of like large amounts of information and try to collapse it down into something where you can communicate like concrete ideas. And that's, going to be important across so many different industries that I just imagine that, like, you know, in kind of like the B2B space where you, like I was saying, like you have tools that are general purpose, like Excel, um, but you also have like sophisticated software for specific verticals that are really just a combination of like rows and tables and cells and like something. But the fact that like some founder or product manager or designer like put intention behind it to make the workflows easier, I think like, we see like how much value that's been able to drive. And I think we're going to see that more in the kind of like knowledge management, thinking, writing space when it comes to generative AI tools as well.
Yeah. Before we talk about maybe some of the cool companies in space, the evaluation of the outputs from
hmm
these large language models, how do you go through that process? Are there a particular way you spot check? Are there things that you already know the answer and you're trying to see if the model is hallucinating? How do you go through that evaluation process or validation
hmm
or using the outputs and say, okay, I'm confident that this is not just the style I want, but it actually include the right evidence, the right fact, the right definition.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's good to try to have like a simple and repeatable process that you can, like a playbook that you can kind of execute over and over again. And I think one thing is just like asking for three different versions of an argument. And I think three is probably just like an easy number. So you can kind of see some differences, but don't get carried away. And then you can like have your own rubric of evaluation, like I like to say just like put yourself in the shoes of your audience and see which one like does this like which one of these three versions has the most impact. And you can go further and kind of create like a more detailed rubric around like, what your audience cares about. And you can even like load that into context for the LLM. That way you can kind of like have this iterative process of like, okay, here's the three versions, here's my evaluation framework, let's score these different options based off of this framework and then choose the best one and then kind of like run that playbook over and over again. Taking pauses to make sure things are making sense, but kind of like having that go-to way to, create these parallel different arguments and then collapse back down to which ones you think are the strongest.
Yeah. Where do you
Yeah.
see the world headed with writing and content generation, given, I mean, essentially what you're describing here is a lot of automation, not just, here's something I give you, but
hmm
something back, but it can be, as we know, that these models are very powerful and generalizable across different things. And
Yeah.
yeah, where do you see the writing space go with these automation? And where is
Yeah,
the
I
role of the human?
Yeah, I mean, these are really big questions. And, I'm trying to take a somewhat optimistic, take here, but I think the optimism is predicated on being really, really intentional about, your use of the tools. And obviously, people aren't always the most intentional, so it really comes down to that, I think. But I would characterize it this way. I would say like the phase we're in now, at least from what I can observe, is when it comes to writing, the tools are really good at taking a small idea and blowing it up into something longer. And then they're also really good at taking like a large bit of text and summarizing it into something like digestible. So actually, like you see a lot of that right now where, someone says like, write me a long memo about like this topic, and then they send the memo, and then someone on the other side's like, okay, summarize this memo for me. And then like, it's like this game of telephone really where you're definitely probably losing something in the exchange, but it's like still a useful yeah, it's still an important use case, I would say, just based on like how little time professionals have in the workplace. But hopefully that's like phase one. I see phase two as more like, okay, once we all get used to how these things work and like how to best, engage with the models, people start to like get a little bit more creative with their approach. And I am hopeful that the next phase is really like, you know, enhancing all of our abilities to think by like having a partner that will always listen to you, will always critique you, will always push you harder, will always try to raise the bar for your thinking. And like hopefully that elevates the quality of writing across the board. But I don't think we're quite in that phase two yet, but I'm hopeful that that's where we're going.
Are there interesting companies in the space that you think they're headed to the right direction, given as a user, you essentially laid out some of the innovation areas and
Mhm.
needs?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a couple of like the cursor for writing kind of companies emerging. I think Lucid is one, Lex is another, like a lot of, cool sounding companies and like with sleek interfaces and, they're highlighting features around like, content management and, you know, being able to like personalize your writing a little bit more. So I think there are some interesting companies, but definitely still on the lookout for ones that really prioritize like the thinking aspect and the thinking process with writing. I think like when I start to see those, we'll definitely be excited to try them out. And right now it's really just it seems like it's all very experimental. And you kind of just have to play around with all the tools and see what works for you. But I don't think there's been like a single one that's really like taken over the market at this point.
Very cool. Okay, I
Yeah.
know you also work in tech with intersection financial services and beyond writing. What are some of the areas that you're super excited about as it relates to AI and data?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I kind of, yeah, work in more regulated spaces like historically. So I think that it'll be really interesting to see like what some of the companies that are on the bleeding edge come up with and then how that kind of like translates into the more uh, risk averse spaces when it comes to AI adoption. So yeah, I think like that's something I'm definitely looking out for. And, overall, how can we look for new use cases for AI that are, positive sum, where like different companies can come together and share data and like, come up with opportunities that are more than they're able to do on their own. So yeah, I think that's what I'm looking for. And yeah, I think I am generally pretty positive. Um, and I think that, the tools that we have are hopefully helping us to be more creative and, get ideas down faster and just like move with more velocity in general. And hopefully that leads to a lot more growth across different industries.
Awesome. Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much, Baxter, for this very interesting conversation and talking about writing and AI. And I learned a lot from our talk today.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Joyce.